The Wendigo's Hunt, a true account. Prologue, the whispered warnings. Every mountain town has its legends. Every isolated community passes down stories meant to keep children close and safe. In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where civilization thins to nothing but pine and stone, there's a particular tale that locals tell with unsettling certainty. It's not presented as folklore. It's presented as fact. They talk about the disappearances. 23 people in the last 90 years. Hikers who ventured too deep. Hunters who didn't return. Families who took one wrong turn on unmarked trails and were simply swallowed by the wilderness. The official reports blamed weather, terrain, and human error. But the locals knew better. They knew what lived in those forests, what hunted there. The Wendigo. Most people dismissed it as a campfire story, a rustic embellishment designed to thrill tourists and keep naive travelers away from restricted areas. A boogeyman for the modern age. That's what Chen thought when she first heard it at a small lodge in Montana, 3 weeks before everything changed. She was 25 years old, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from genuine confidence and an unquenchable love of life. Her Instagram was a testament to wanderlust. Summits conquered, sunrises captured, landscapes that took your breath away. She had quit her corporate job in Seattle 6 months ago to pursue what she called authentic existence. Solo travel. No guides, no companions, no distractions. Just her, the wild, and whatever discoveries awaited. Sarah had dismissed the Wendigo story the same way she dismissed most warnings. With a smile and a certainty that nothing bad would happen to her. She was careful, she told herself. Experienced. She had hiked every major trail in the Pacific Northwest. She had camped alone in grizzly country, navigated whitewater, summit peaks that would intimidate most people. This would be no different. She was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Part 1, the trail. The Blackroot Pass Trail wasn't officially on any map anymore. That should have been her first warning. The National Forest Service had quietly decommissioned it in 1998, removing markers and posting occasional signs requesting hikers not use the route. Officially, the reason was erosion and safety concerns. But the ranger who reluctantly gave Sarah directions at the Missoula office had hesitated before providing coordinates. He'd looked at her in a way she couldn't quite interpret. Not judgmental, not dismissive, something closer to pity. That trail's not maintained, he'd said carefully. There are better alternatives. But the trail had exactly what Sarah wanted. Isolation, challenge, and a route that would take her through untouched wilderness for 3 full days before emerging near Whitefish. No crowds, no other hikers, just raw, genuine wilderness. She'd started on a Wednesday in early November. The weather forecast called for a cold front moving in Thursday night, but nothing catastrophic. Early snow was possible, but her gear was rated for far worse. She carried 4 days of supplies, a satellite communicator, a quality knife, bear spray, and a pistol, legal in Montana if you knew how to carry it safely, and Sarah did. The first day was magnificent. The kind of day that reminded her why she'd abandoned her comfortable life. The aspens had turned a brilliant gold, and the afternoon light filtered through them like liquid amber. She hiked 12 miles and camped near an alpine meadow, seeing no one, hearing nothing but wind and the occasional bird. She took photos that would garner 5,000 likes. She wrote in her journal about the profound silence of solitude. The second day was when things started to feel wrong. She'd woken at dawn to find the sky transformed. The cold front had arrived overnight with unexpected fury. Snow had begun falling around 3 a.m., and now the forest was buried under 8 inches of powder. Her weather app showed the storm intensifying, with another foot expected by evening. This changed her plans, but not dramatically. She had supplies for 4 days. She could push hard, cover ground, and get through before the worst arrived. What she didn't know was that she'd already passed the point of no return. She packed quickly, her breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. The snow was beautiful but disorienting. Her familiar trail markers were obscured or absent. The forest looked uniform in every direction, white and gray and the dark green of evergreens. She had a GPS device, but it felt unnecessary. She knew the general direction, east toward the pass. The morning passed in a rhythm of hiking and navigation. By midday, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained a heavy, threatening gray. She'd made about 8 miles, slower than she'd hoped due to the snow depth and cold. She was building a campfire when she saw the first thing that made her pause. Tracks deep, distinct tracks in the snow, heading parallel to her path, maybe 20 yards away through the trees. They were large. Canine, almost certainly. Wolf, most likely, though possibly a large cougar. She knew better than to be afraid.
Predators avoida humans.
She'd seen wolf scat before, heard them in the distance on previous trips. It was normal, natural. Still, she made sure to hang her food properly that night, and she kept her pistol close. She told herself these were normal precautions. She told herself she wasn't frightened. The third day began with a sense of wrongness she couldn't articulate. Sarah woke at 6 in the morning to a sound that didn't belong. Not an animal sound exactly, but something carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the forest. A sound like wind through a canyon, except there was no canyon here. Like something between a howl and a moan, stretched and distorted. She lay in her sleeping bag for several minutes, telling herself it was just the forest creating acoustic illusions. Sound traveled strangely in mountains, bounced off rock and wood and snow in ways that confused the ear. She'd been hiking long enough to know this, but she'd also been hiking long enough to trust her instincts. Those instincts were screaming at her. She packed everything in 15 minutes, not bothering with breakfast. She needed to move, needed to put distance between herself and whatever had made that sound. The GPS said she was still 15 miles from the end point. In normal conditions, that was a full day's hike. In this snow, maybe longer, but she could make good time if she pushed. The forest around her felt different as she walked. The ambient sounds had changed. No birdsang. She heard no squirrels, no movement in the undergrowth. Just the crunch of her boots breaking trail through the snow and her own breathing. For the first hour, she saw the tracks again. The same large canine prints, still moving roughly parallel to her path. Then they seemed to veer away, and she relaxed slightly. Just a wolf that had been curious, now moving on. At around midday, she found the elk. It was a large bull, lying in a clearing she'd almost passed through without seeing it. At first, she thought it had died naturally, succumbed to the cold or age or starvation. Then she got closer and realized what had actually happened. The corpse was torn open. Its ribs were splayed outward like someone had deliberately pried them apart. The organs were missing, not scattered about, but deliberately removed. Most disturbing was the head. The eyes were gone. Only empty sockets remained, along with a precise surgical removal of the tongue. Sarah's mind tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a normal predator kill. Wolves brought down elk, sure, but they fed on them in a particular way. They didn't do this. They didn't remove organs with such precision, didn't scoop out eyes with methodical care. She backed away from the corpse, her hand moving to her pistol without her consciously deciding to do so. Her heart was beating faster now, her breathing shallow. This was impossible. This was... A sound stopped her mid-thought. The same moaning howl she'd heard that morning, but closer now. Much closer. And this time it didn't sound like the wind or acoustics. It sounded like something alive. Something that shouldn't exist but was making the sound anyway. Sarah started walking faster. Not quite running, but close to it. She moved through the snow with determined strides, trying not to think about the methodically dissected elk behind her. Trying not to think about what animal could kill like that. The forest seemed to close in. The trees grew denser, the shadows deeper. She was still hiking during daylight, but the canopy was so thick that the world felt perpetually twilight, as if she'd stepped into some parallel version of the forest where the sun couldn't quite reach. She walked for hours, pushing herself hard, following the GPS coordinates, refusing to look back. The landscape began to blur together, snow and trees and rock, endlessly repeating. Her legs burned. Her lungs ached in the thin, cold air. By the time she stopped to make camp, close to 6 in the evening, she'd covered nearly 20 miles. Her body was exhausted, muscles shaking with fatigue. But her mind wouldn't stop racing. She set up her tent in a tight stand of conifers, choosing a location where she could see in multiple directions. She built a fire even though she normally kept camps minimalist. She needed light. She needed heat. She needed the psychological comfort of flames even though she knew better than to believe fire would protect her from anything truly dangerous. As the darkness fell complete, she sat by the fire and tried to rationalize what she'd seen. The elk had been killed by multiple wolves, she decided. Maybe a desperate pack in hunting season. Predators did disturbing things when they were hungry enough. As for the moaning sound, it could have been wind, or an elk in distress, or any number of natural explanations. But she didn't quite believe any of it. Around 9 p.m., she heard footsteps in the snow. They were bipedal. That was the first thing that registered in her shocked brain. Footsteps that weren't paw prints. Footsteps from something that walked on two legs. Sarah reached for her pistol, but then the footsteps stopped. Whoever, whatever, had been walking through the forest had halted just beyond the firelight, somewhere in the darkness. "Hello!" Sarah called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended.
I'm armed.
No response. No movement. Just the sound of wind in the branches and the crackling of her fire. "I have a gun," she said again, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "I'm calling for help." She reached for her satellite communicator with shaking hands. A sound erupted from the darkness. Not a scream, not quite a roar. Something between them. A sound that seemed physically impossible, a vocalization that no human throat could produce. It was a sound of hunger and rage and something else. Something that seemed almost intelligent, almost accusatory. Sarah fired her pistol 3 times in the direction of the sound. The gunshots cracked through the forest, impossibly loud in the silence. For a moment there was no response. Then silence returned. But it was a different silence. A waiting silence. Sarah threw logs onto her fire, building it up until flames licked several feet into the dark. She kept her pistol in her lap, her satellite communicator ready. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the gun steady. Nothing emerged from the forest. Nothing attacked. But something was out there, watching. Waiting. She was absolutely certain of it. Part 2, The Hunt. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She maintained her fire, kept her pistol loaded, and sat in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on psychosis. Every sound was analyzed, categorized, assessed for threat level. The wind became a hunting animal. The creaking of trees became footsteps. The shift of snow from branches became something approaching. Dawn came like a benediction. As the sky began to lighten to gray, Sarah forced herself to eat something, even though her stomach rejected it. She drank water. She checked her supplies. She calculated that she had about 15 miles left to the trailhead. She could make it in one day if she pushed hard. One more day of travel and she'd be out. One more day. She allowed herself to believe, as she extinguished her fire and packed her tent, that she might actually survive this. That belief lasted approximately 4 hours into the hike. The day began normally enough. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clearing slightly. She made good time, following her GPS, keeping her eyes open for any signs of the thing. She still couldn't quite call it what the ranger had implied, that had made those sounds. She saw things that suggested she wasn't alone. She found more of those precise tracks, those two-legged footprints that seemed almost human except for their size and the depth of the impression. She found trees that had been deliberately stripped of bark at a height that was too high for any normal animal. She found more kill sites, a porcupine that had been carefully dissected, its quills removed and arranged in patterns on the snow. By early afternoon, she descended into a deep ravine where the GPS showed her trail should pass. The sides were steep, rocky despite the snow cover. The forest here was dense, almost claustrophobic. She could see maybe 30 yards in any direction before trees and shadow consumed her view. This was where the sounds started. Not the moaning howls from before, but other vocalizations. Sharp clicking sounds. Something that might have been language if language could sound like breaking bones. The noises echoed off the ravine walls, making it impossible to determine where they were coming from. They could be 50 yards away or 5. They could be above her or below. Sarah moved faster, her careful hiking transformed into something closer to panic. She wasn't trying to enjoy nature anymore. She was trying to survive. That's when she saw it. Later, when she tried to describe it to someone in the small hospital in Missoula, she would struggle to articulate exactly what she'd witnessed. The human brain has difficulty processing things that don't match its models of reality. The more accurately she tried to describe it, the more incredulous her listeners became. So eventually she stopped trying. But here's what she saw. It emerged from behind a massive spruce tree about 40 yards ahead of her on the trail. At first, she thought it was a human. Bipedal, roughly human-shaped, standing maybe 7 feet tall. Her mind, desperate for normalcy, tried to categorize it as a very large man. Perhaps someone from a nearby cabin who'd gotten lost. Then it moved, and she realized nothing human moved like that. Its limbs seemed too long, proportioned wrong, articulating at angles that suggested too many joints. Its head was disproportionately large compared to its body, and its face, God, its face, was a nightmare amalgamation of features that shouldn't coexist. The bone structure suggested something between a deer and a human and something else, something that had never evolved naturally. Its eyes were too large and glowed with a sickly yellow-green luminescence despite the daylight. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that seemed to go back forever, an impossible number of them arranged in rows. Sarah would later learn that in some interpretations of Native American legends, a Wendigo's appearance was said to change depending on what a person expected to see. It was a creature that existed partially outside normal reality, shaped by the observer's fear and expectation. All she knew in that moment was that she was looking at something that was fundamentally, cosmically wrong. It looked at her, and she felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. Then it smiled. That was the part that would haunt her the most. Not the teeth or the impossible anatomy or the wrongness of its existence. The fact that it smiled, as if it recognized her, as if this moment amused it. Sarah ran. She turned and ran back up the ravine, abandoning the trail, crashing through trees and branches. The pistol was still in her hand, but she knew with absolute certainty that shooting it would be useless. Nothing a 9mm bullet could do would stop something like that. She didn't hear it chasing her. That was somehow worse than if she had. She could feel it behind her anyway, that presence, that vast and hungry attention. The forest seemed to ripple around her as she ran, as if the wilderness itself was conspiring to slow her down, to guide her toward the thing rather than away from it. She burst out of the ravine onto higher ground, and the density of the forest thinned slightly. Her lungs were burning, her legs pumping on pure adrenaline. She ran for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. She ran until her body simply gave out and she collapsed against a rocky outcropping, gasping for air, her vision tunneling. She was going to die. The certainty of it was absolute. But she didn't die. Not then, anyway. What happened instead was almost stranger. Silence returned to the forest. The sense of being hunted evaporated as suddenly as it had arrived. She was alone again, just a terrified woman in the winter woods, alone with her fear. Sarah sat against that rock for a long time, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself she'd hallucinated the whole thing. Stress could do that. Isolation could do that. Fear and exhaustion could conspire to create vivid false memories. But she knew what she'd seen, and she knew with equal certainty that it was letting her live. For now, as the sun began its descent toward evening, Sarah took stock of her situation. Her GPS showed she'd run northwest, directly away from the trail. The path to the trailhead was actually southeast, which meant she'd essentially added miles to her journey. She was now perhaps 20 miles from civilization. More distance, more night in the forest, and more time for it to hunt. She decided to make for higher ground. Predators operated more easily in forested valleys. If she could reach an exposed ridge or peak, she'd have visibility and fewer places for something to hide. She began climbing, moving methodically, conserving her energy. The sun was giving her light at least, though the shadows were growing longer. As she climbed, she began to notice a pattern. There were markers cut into the trees. Not natural markings, but deliberate. Symbols that looked almost like runes or glyphs. She followed them, and they led her higher, toward what seemed to be a distinct trail. An old trail, one that was being maintained by something. The symbols changed as she followed them. At first, they were simple marks, but as she climbed higher, they became more elaborate. Some looked like warnings or protective sigils. Others looked like directions, routes planned by something intelligent. Near the summit of the ridge, Sarah found a structure. It was old, perhaps 50 years or more, built of wood and stone in a way that suggested considerable effort. It was partially collapsed, open to the elements, but its purpose was clear. It had been a shelter, a watchtower of some kind, the kind of place someone would build if they were trying to protect themselves from something. Inside the ruin, she found a journal. It was wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the weather. The pages were brittle and yellowed. The ink faded but still readable. The first entry was dated May 1974. The author was named Richard Caldwell, identified as a forest ranger. Sarah sat in the ruins of that structure as the sun descended, and she read Richard Caldwell's account of horror. Part 3, The Journal. The entries were sporadic, spanning almost 2 years. Caldwell wrote about investigating disappearances in the forest. He wrote about finding bodies or parts of them. He wrote about the tracks and the mutilations and the impossible vocalizations. He wrote about seeing it, the same thing Sarah had seen, describing it with language that conveyed his absolute terror. But he'd also written about trying to understand it. Caldwell had interviewed locals, older rangers, Native Americans from reservations nearby. He'd compiled research on Wendigo mythology and compared it to what he'd witnessed. His conclusion, stated near the end of his journal, was chilling in its matter-of-factness. It's real. It's been here for longer than the park has existed. Longer than the nation has existed. It's native to these mountains the way bears are native, the way wolves are native. It hunts humans, but not constantly. It's selective. It takes perhaps 1 or 2 a year, sometimes fewer. It seems to prefer certain types of people. I suspect those alone, those far from help, those disconnected from communities that would search for them. The official disappearances will never explain what's actually happening because no authority will believe it. Caldwell had used his watchtower to observe patterns. He'd tracked the thing's movement, its hunting grounds, the times of year it was most active. He'd discovered that it followed a specific territory and that this was the part that would most affect Sarah. It was aware of being observed. It had watched him watching it, and it had eventually decided that watching was no longer acceptable. The final entry was dated October 1976. Caldwell wrote that he was going to confront it. He was going to go armed and prepared and end this. He wrote about his family back east, his belief that some things were worth dying for. He wrote that if anything happened to him, please read this and know that I tried. There were no more entries after that. Sarah sat in the growing darkness, holding this journal that was nearly 50 years old, and understood what had happened to Richard Caldwell. He'd tried to fight. He'd tried to kill it. It had killed him instead. She carefully placed the journal back in its oilcloth wrapping and left it where she'd found it. Some documentation of the truth would be better than none, she thought. At least if she didn't make it, there would be evidence. Even if no one believed it. The night was the longest of Sarah's life. She built a fire in the ruins of Caldwell's watchtower, using stones to create a barrier against the wind. She didn't sleep. She watched the forest and waited. Around midnight it came. This time it didn't hide. It emerged from the darkness into the firelight, standing at the edge of her visibility, regarding her with those terrible yellow-green eyes. Up close, she could see details she'd missed in the ravine. Its skin was gray and translucent, with what looked like veins visible beneath the surface, glowing faintly with bioluminescence. Its joints were articulated in ways that suggested an evolution that had taken a completely different path from human development. It was both skeletal and somehow muscular, both incredibly thin and radiating a sense of immense strength. It was the most beautiful and most horrifying thing Sarah had ever seen. For what felt like hours, they simply looked at each other. The thing didn't attack, didn't even move. It just observed her, studying her with an intelligence that was undeniable. Then it did something unexpected. It made a sound that was almost musical, a series of clicks and tones that built into something complex and strange. It took Sarah several seconds to realize what she was hearing. It was trying to communicate. She couldn't understand the words, if they were words, but the intent seemed clear. It was telling her something, explaining something. The way its eyes looked at her, the way its body language shifted, it was making a statement that contained meaning. Then it retreated. It walked backward into the darkness, its form gradually being consumed by shadow and night, until finally it was gone. Sarah waited until dawn to leave the watchtower. Part 4. The Escape. The morning of the 4th day was clear and cold. Sarah had survived the night. She still had maybe 10 miles to the trailhead, perhaps more depending on the exact route. She was running low on supplies. She'd intended this to be a 4-day hike and had already exceeded that. But she could make it. Adrenaline and fear were good substitutes for food. She packed the journal, knowing it would add weight, knowing she might be making a survival mistake by choosing documentation over a few pounds of food. But it was Richard Caldwell's testimony, and the world needed to know the truth, even if the world didn't believe it. She began descending the ridge, working her way back toward where the trail should be. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, though still laden with that undercurrent of strangeness. She saw more of those carved symbols. She saw more kill sites. She saw evidence of the thing everywhere, in the stripped trees and the arranged bones and the disturbed earth. What she didn't see was the thing itself. By midday, she'd reached the valley floor. By her calculations, she should be close to the trail again, close to finding her way out. She allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that escape was possible. That's when she heard the voices. Two hikers, male and female, their accents suggesting they were European. She could hear their cheerful conversation as they moved through the forest perhaps a quarter-mile away. They were on the trail, following the same path she'd abandoned in terror 2 days ago. Sarah's first instinct was relief. Other people. Safety. But almost immediately, that relief transformed into something else. Those people were going to encounter the thing. They were walking directly into hunting grounds, unaware and unprepared. And she knew with certainty that if they did encounter it, they wouldn't escape the way she had. The thing would hunt them because they were there, because they had made themselves available. She had a choice to make. She could make her way quietly south, get to the trailhead, get to safety. She could save herself and leave those hikers to whatever fate awaited them. The thing had let her go. It seemed to have decided she was either not worth eating or worth keeping alive. Either way, she had a chance. Or she could try to warn them. Sarah stood in the forest for a long moment, wrestling with her survival instinct. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to get away, to get to safety, to leave this nightmare behind. She took a breath and shouted, "Turn around! Get off the trail! Get out of here!" The voices stopped. A moment later, one of them called back, "Hello? Who's there? Don't stay on this trail. Turn back!" Sarah shouted again, "Go back the way you came. Now! Is someone lost?" The female voice sounded concerned, approaching her. "We have supplies, we can help you." "No, you don't understand." Sarah moved forward, pushing through the trees toward their voices. "You need to get out of this forest. There's something dangerous." She burst through the tree line to see them clearly for the first time. A man and a woman, both probably in their 30s, both wearing new-looking hiking gear. They looked safe, civilized, impossibly far from the reality Sarah now inhabited. "We have a satellite phone," the woman said, reaching for her pack. "We can call for help. Are you injured?" "We need to go," Sarah said. "Right now. Back the way you came. Walk quickly. Don't run unless I tell you to run. But we need to move." The man looked at the woman, and Sarah saw them exchange the look of people who were deciding whether she was sane or genuinely in need of help. "Look," the man said carefully. "We're equipped, we're trained, and we have communication. Why don't we take a minute and you can tell us what's happening?" Sarah's frustration exploded into something close to a scream. "There is no time. There's something in this forest, something that kills people. And if you stay here, you're going to die." Behind them, maybe 100 yards back down the trail, Sarah saw something shift in the shadows. A large shape, two eyes that glowed yellow-green. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. She grabbed the woman's arm. "Now. We move now." What happened next was chaos and terror and the kind of adrenaline-fueled action that Sarah would only be able to piece together later. They started running. The man was yelling something, probably trying to understand what was happening. The woman was asking questions Sarah didn't have time to answer. The thing erupted from the trees behind them, and it was moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. It closed the distance with terrifying speed. The man screamed something that might have been a curse or a prayer, and suddenly he had a knife in his hand. He turned to face the creature, and Sarah knew with absolute clarity that he was about to die. "Run!" she yelled at the woman, and she ran herself, pulling at the European woman's arm, dragging her off the trail and into the dense forest on either side. Behind them, they heard the sound of the thing attacking. They heard the man scream, a sound of shocked agony and disbelief. They heard something tearing, something breaking, something dying. Sarah didn't look back. She pulled the woman through the undergrowth over rocks, through thorns and branches. The woman was crying, asking questions that weren't in English, gasping for breath. They ran for what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes. When Sarah finally stopped, she pulled them both behind a massive boulder formation. They crouched there, shaking, hardly breathing, listening. The sounds of the thing moving through the forest gradually faded. It seemed to lose interest quickly once they'd put significant distance between themselves and the kill site. "What was that?" the woman whispered, her English breaking down under trauma. "What was that thing?" "Something that shouldn't exist," Sarah said. The two of them made their way to the trailhead together, moving slowly and carefully, jumping at every sound. They emerged from the forest around 6 in the evening, staggering into a ranger station where they immediately reported finding a dead hiker. The official search and rescue team found the man's body the next day. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, probably by bears or a large predator. There was no mention of the thing Sarah had seen. There was no investigation into impossible anatomy or the precise, surgical way the body had been torn apart. The man's name had been Henrik Soren, and he was 28 years old. His girlfriend survived their encounter and eventually agreed to corroborate Sarah's story, though she did so reluctantly. She didn't want to be known as the woman who'd been attacked by a monster. She wanted her life to go back to normal. But normal for both of them was impossible. Epilogue: the aftermath. Sarah spent 4 days in the hospital, treated for exposure, exhaustion, and trauma. The psychiatrists diagnosed her with acute stress disorder. They suggested that her ordeal had resulted in confabulation, false memories that had filled in the gaps of what happened with impossible narratives. They were very kind about it, but the implication was clear. She'd hallucinated the Wendigo. She didn't argue with them. She gave her statements to the authorities, describing what she could without mentioning the thing directly. She talked about animal attacks and getting lost and surviving on her wits and luck. She mentioned Caldwell's journal, but it was never found. Either the forest had reclaimed it, or someone had gone to that watchtower and removed it deliberately. Within 3 weeks, she was released with prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication and a referral to a trauma counselor. Within 2 months, the whole incident had faded from the news cycle. The official report attributed the European hiker's death to a bear attack. The case was closed. Sarah returned to her apartment in Seattle and tried to resume her life. She deleted all her hiking photos from social media. She resigned from her travel writing engagements. She stopped going outside more than necessary. Her friends were concerned, but she couldn't explain the depth of her fear without sounding insane. After 6 months, her therapist suggested she might be recovering. She'd stopped having nightmares most nights. She was eating regularly again. She was holding down a job. But she still woke sometimes with the absolute certainty that it was watching her. She still heard its voice sometimes, that impossible vocalization, in her dreams or in the spaces between waking and sleep. She did eventually write down everything that happened, though she only shared it privately with a small group of people. She published it under a pseudonym online, in the forums where other people shared paranormal experiences. Most responses were skeptical. Some were cruel, suggesting she was either lying or delusional. But some responses came from other people who had survived encounters in those mountains. People whose stories corroborated hers in small, specific ways. People who had seen the yellow-green eyes. People who had heard that impossible voice. People who had gotten lucky. In the years that followed, Sarah learned that the Wendigo was far more common in native traditions than she'd realized. It wasn't just the mountains of Montana. It existed in forests across North America, in Canada, in the deep woods of the eastern states, in places where the wilderness still held territories completely separate from human civilization. It had been there longer than humans. It would be there long after humans left. Some nights, Sarah wondered if it had let her go because it had some greater plan. Some nights, she wondered if it was still out there, in those mountains where she'd nearly died, watching her, remembering her. Most nights, she just tried to sleep and tried not to hear the click and moan of its voice calling from the darkness outside her window. She never went hiking again. She never set foot in that forest again. But sometimes, on winter nights when the snow was falling and the wind was howling through the trees, she'd look out her window and see, just for a moment, the glow of yellow-green eyes watching from the darkness. And she'd know that some predators don't stop hunting just because you've escaped. Some predators have very long memories. Some predators have forever. This account was taken from personal interviews with the survivor, supplemented by official records and third-party corroboration. The name of the primary subject has been changed to protect privacy. Readers are advised that venturing into remote wilderness areas carries risks that extend beyond those described in official safety guidelines. The forest remembers. And some things in the forest are very, very hungry.